Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back from lunch. I know this is a difficult time. Thank you, Anne. All right. It's my pleasure to introduce today's panelists at the panel session on real-world implications of AI in enterprise IT. So my pleasure to introduce Ashmeet, Sidana and Mark Gorenberg, two very experienced investors from Silicon Valley who really, are pioneers in their own. I'm going to give you a brief introduction and really leave it to them to open up the conversation. So Mark Gorenberg is founding partner at Zetta Venture Partners, one of the early stage funds focused on the intelligent enterprise. Over his 26 years of venture investment career, he's served on the board of numerous very successful startups, including Omniture, AdForce, NetDynamics, Scopus, and several others. He serves on the board of Aria, Domo. We're a very happy customer, Mark. Trace3 is of Domo, Senzik, Optimine, and several others. In 2011, Mark served on President Barack Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. He's on the MIT Board of Trustees, and he's on the Technology Advisory Committee of the FCC. Welcome, Mark. Delighted to have you here with us.
Thank you, Savitha. It's great to be here.
Very welcome. Ashmeet, Sidana, it's a pleasure to introduce Ashmeet. And I always find Ashmeet's path to venture extremely interesting. He's founder and calls himself Chief Engineer of Engineering Capital. And you'll hear from him a little bit more on how that resonates. His experience includes managing multiple venture capital funds. He serves on the board of multiple startups. But most importantly, at least to me, before his decade as a venture capitalist, he was an operating executive, right? He ran product management at VMware, and he really fundamentally was part of transforming that industry in terms of making virtualization mainstream. So he brings a unique perspective, having been an operating executive for 10 years and then bringing that experience to venture. Several of his investments include Polera, Freewheel, Enquera, Purify. You can look at them. They're all public or acquired. Right now, his current investments that are relevant to Trace3 include Rubrik, Diamenti, Menlo Security, Prismo, Baffle, and many others that we are currently working with. Welcome, Ashmeet.
Thank you.
All right. Why don't we begin with introductions? So, Mark, maybe tell us a little bit about your fund, your investment thesis, and how you think about venture.
Okay, great. Thanks, Savitha. So we started back in 2013 with the idea that there's been eras of venture capital that have been seminal in creating the next generation of information technology investing. And we've gone through this evolution of hardware to software to cloud, and now we believe it's about intelligence, all these cloud-based systems that are producing lots of data, but that data wasn't being used. And now with that data and algorithms, we're able to create the next revolution. So we started the fund with the idea that software had become commodity, and it was really the data and algorithms that gave it value. And with that, we've now invested across areas, and we're only investing as well in enterprise. We're not doing any consumer investing. So we've invested across the board of data science platforms, enterprise line of business, where data makes the outcome more optimal, vertical markets, and infrastructure and security. We named it Zetta after the Zettabyte, start of the Zettabyte era. But actually, if you were here this morning for Mark Campbell's keynote, which the brilliant sort of rubric of S's, I'm going to rename the fund the Smart Venture Capital Fund now after the Smart era. So there you go. In the idea from simple to savvy to smart.
Wonderful.
Outstanding, Ashmeet.
Thank you, Savitha. Like you mentioned, I was at VMware before, and before going into venture, I started engineering capital with a very simple observation. About 5 years ago, I noticed that if you went to the best run data centers in the world, namely the data centers being run by Google, Alibaba, Amazon, and Facebook, you would find that they had not bought any servers from HP, IBM, or Dell. They didn't buy any storage from EMC or NetApp. They didn't buy any switches from Cisco or Juniper. They didn't buy any databases from Oracle. They didn't buy any operating systems from Microsoft or VMware. And I can keep going on and on and on, naming the who's who of the IT industry. I mean, every single company that I named thinks of themselves as the world's best at that subset of IT. Oracle will say we make the world's best database. Well, guess what? There's a lot of database that runs which is not Oracle. And so that observation led me to believe that there was going to be a tsunami, because these data centers were 100 to 1,000 times more efficient, faster, more secure, more agile. And so I knew there was going to be a revolution on the enterprise side, and that's really the transformation that I focus on at Engineering Capital. First investor in all the companies that Savita mentioned, very early stage, always looking for that technical advantage. I'm an engineer, I'm a geek. I call the firm Engineering Capital because we're always looking for a technical advantage in the startups. That's the only way we can compete against big companies.
Thank you. I think together we have covered the full stack, right? So Ashmeet,
sure.
and you're an application. So let's take both of them one at a time. So Mark, so the theme of our panel really here is around AI. Now AI has become such a buzzword that really it's almost lost meaning. We have to kind of get a little more nuanced. But maybe beginning with kind of today's customers, our customers and their customers, right? We have both B2B and B2C customers in the room here. So what does an AI-driven enterprise mean to today's customers, right? So when an enterprise is looking to say, I need to be more AI-driven and in serving my customers, how should they be thinking about that? What does that mean?
So what we look at is, and I know AI is sort of the general term, but I think we primarily talk about it as machine learning in what we do. And so, companies are generating a lot of data, and they haven't been really using that data, but that data is their advantage now. I would argue that that data rights have become the new IP rights. Your intellectual property actually is your data today. Everything else is fairly reproducible. So with that, we look at applications over time. We wrote a thesis on something called the AI risk curve, and that was the idea that it's not technology that's holding back the use of machine learning. It's really the acceptance by the users of using those applications. And so over time, we've seen that move from new engagement apps that sit on top of the system of record. And those engagement apps started with the creation of revenue. So new engagement apps around sales and marketing, retail, et cetera, to increase your revenue side. But now we're seeing more and more this movement towards cost savings. So, that on top of, for example, we've invested in 4 manufacturing companies now that use that AI engagement to do everything from continuous improvement on the production floor to better inventory, to better production operations in terms of figuring out warning signals for production times, to frankly new databases that are helping to do real-time IoT. So that's just sort of one sort of evolution, and then the next evolution is using this data to be able to replace what humans are doing. So more AI-centric things.
Okay.
So that's basically to that level. But in terms of the data system itself, I think what we're seeing is the big change is bringing in data scientists. And we're now going software itself, instead of being created, is being assembled. And the data now needs a set of products to basically collect collaborative models to be able to to have reproducibility of those models, transparency of those models. In this movement from waterfall to agile to now working with model management is a whole different concept. And so bringing model management concepts into the data center, I think, has become really important.
Great. And this morning, we were talking about data log, and that's an example of a company solving a problem in that data management lifecycle. So,
that's right.
Great. Thank you, Mark. So, Ashmeet, the complementary side, right? So what is, given that today's panel, we're talking about AI, and Mark referenced really the application suite that our customers are interested in. What are the implications of that to infrastructure? as our clients think about transforming their data center strategy, how should they think about the infrastructure?
Sure. There's been massive implications on the infrastructure with this move to AI, the adoption of AI. But let me motivate that by first, just double-clicking on what I mean by AI and how it's really being used at the simplest, lowest level. What is AI when somebody applies it in an enterprise or a consumer? What we're really talking about is taking a set of data and using that to make a prediction. To use that data to say, therefore something else will happen. This is revolutionary and different from what we used to do before, where we would take some data, and the way we would transform that data was we would write an algorithm. We would write a set of instructions, a menu, a process, a flow chart, which is traditionally how it was done. This is the revolution of AI, which is simply given the data, applying AI techniques, machine learning techniques, neural networks, etc., we can now make predictions better and better. You can apply these types of predictions at the highest level. For example, as Mark ended by saying that we could replace humans. Yes, it is possible. I know this is controversial, but it is possible to replace even at the human level certain jobs with good, thoughtful applications of AI. RPA, robotic process automation, is a huge force, and we're going to see more and more of that. That's the reality. Or to the lowest level, some very, very simple mechanical, routine decisions could be replaced with an AI, with a prediction. For example, where should I put a certain button on a screen? What color should I show to a customer when they come to my website? Let's face it, that's how Facebook and Google work. They apply AI to every single pixel that you see. They are extremely good. They have enormous amounts of data, and they're able to apply it. Enterprises are going to be somewhere in the middle. I don't think today, if I was in an enterprise today, we are at either of those two extremes. In other words, you can't just start suddenly replacing people. That's not going to happen. Long term, yes, just like long term, we will have autonomous cars and flying machines and all of those things. And at the same point, I don't think enterprises are ready today to work at the pixel level. The ROI isn't there, the data isn't there to work the way a Google or a Facebook applies AI for them. So the real meat is in the middle. Where have we seen early adoption? We've seen early adoptions obviously on things like credit scoring, risk. Those were the very early applications where AI could do a better job than the algorithm that people had built to do the same job earlier. And so we started seeing adoption for things like that. Now we are seeing things in that middle case where people are applying AI and saying, okay, could I make this decision better because I have enough data for it? But I emphasize the word data, it all comes down to data. AI is nothing more than data with the same algorithm being applied to make a prediction with it. So it's really a discussion on data.
Data. How about examples? Sometimes examples really bring to life, some of the answers.
Let me give an example of data being sort of transformed with the use of AI today in enterprises. So almost every enterprise has some sort of a FAQ, knowledge base, help system, perhaps on their website, perhaps on an internal wiki, etc. These documents just tend to sit over there. I have a company called Passage AI, which is able to take a static knowledge base and automatically convert that into a conversational bot. In other words, you can send text messages to this now what used to be a static knowledge base and ask it questions. And because it's a computer, it could be connected to back-end systems. So we have a customer, Kohl's, for example, where Kohl's is a consumer company, lots of people walk into the store. One of the questions they always ask is, how many loyalty points do I have? Where do I check my loyalty points on my loyalty card? Can I get a discount with this loyalty card? They have an FAQ on their website. That's a dead page. Nobody goes and reads that. The number one customer query is, how do I check my loyalty balance, and then can I use that? Now, with a company like Passage AI, automatically your existing knowledge base has become a live agent answering questions to the customer.
That's a great example, Ashmeet, and we're starting to get to know Passage. Yeah, Mark, how about some examples? I think examples in different industries really bring to life the potential here.
I think that one of the to add on to what Ashmeet was saying, I think one of the things that's the interesting challenge today, but one of the things where companies are getting far more benefit is the willingness to share data with startups and allow them to crowdsource that data amongst lots and lots of companies. Sort of the techniques that people like Google would use for better search, right? But apply it to the enterprise. So for example, a company that we invested in called Inside Sales has data from the sales calls of, thousands of companies, 6 trillion pieces of data now accumulated in mass. So from that, if you're using their product to call your customers, you have the benefit of living on top of those thousands of companies' past interactions to figure out in an anonymous way how to help your sales reps be better. So for example, that allows you to figure out which leads are likely to close, or which sales reps in an inside sales group should talk to which potential customers, or whether you should email or call people, or what time of day you should try to contact people. You can keep teasing this out from the data. Now, the customers you don't really know necessarily what's going on under the covers, but what you see is 15 to 30% improvement in sales conversions. So, and that's from the willingness of being able to basically allow companies to use your data in an anonymous way to work with other companies and basically crowdsource that for the greater good and to get you more benefit. On the manufacturing side, an interesting company that I know you've talked to is a company called Falconry. So Falconry can basically accumulate all the data of time series from everything that's happening on your production line, and from that over time figure out early warning windows for when things are going to fail. And so then you have that warning buffer to basically allow you to ahead of time do better maintenance schedules or to improve your yield of your production line until you think you're going to get into those warning areas. So you're seeing it on sort of all different types of applications.
Are there some industries that are more ready, let's say, for these predictive models and these types of techniques than others?
Well, I can talk about some of the vertical markets, that we've invested in, which are insurance has been one where we're starting to see a company called Tractable that has taken the millions of images now and trained of car accidents, and can basically tell you better than an insurance assessor can now what's actually happened to that accident, and can do it 10 times faster. But that's all the training of running on. So insurance has been an early adopter, retail has been an early adopter. I think production is starting to become an adopter. Energy has become an early adopter, and clearly there's lots of fintech applications that have been early adopters. And now we're seeing, so the next wave I think is going to be a lot about healthcare. Human health and health of the planet are two that are just at that cusp of starting to look at the use of data rather than just the workflow and trying to get improvements on that. And we go back to that concept of the AI risk curve. They're also the ones that sit at that intersection of the risk curve where users are saying, yes, we think the technology will work, but we're not sure yet if we're willing to trust a computer system to basically do what people like doctors do today.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we did, starting to get to know one of your companies in the healthcare space, in that space as well.
Maya.
So
notice how broad, I just want to add a comment to what Mark said. Notice how broad the description is that Mark used. I completely agree with it in terms of the industries that it will transform. So really, it doesn't matter what sort of company you run or what organization you're in, you're going to get impacted by AI unquestionably. It's just a question of when and how much and how do you get there. And the leading indicator for that, if you're sitting around looking at yourself and saying, what is it in my organization, where is it going to apply? The answer is data. Wherever there is data, you can apply AI, and the more of it that you have, the faster, better, more efficient it's going to be. So that's really the way to think about it at a very practical level, which is like, oh my God, this is where I'm getting clicks, this is where I'm getting data, this is where someone is entering something. That's where I think I can apply AI.
That's a great lead into my next question here, Ashmeet, for you, because I think, as you know, we have a lot of practitioners in the room. They worry about their infrastructure. And what's really interesting is, we have them across the spectrum in terms of industries and their requirements. Where some industries still want bare metal, on-prem capabilities for the kind of performance requirements they have. On the other hand, we have consumer internet type clients who are 100% on the cloud, right? So what does this new class of AI-driven, AI-led applications, what demands does it pose on the infrastructure? And how should, the audience who's in different parts of that spectrum, how should they think about it?
We are at a very interesting inflection point in the industry because in addition to AI, which has been just a transformational capability that got developed, we also had the cloud wave come in. The cloud is nothing to do with AI, but of course a lot of AI runs in the cloud, is transformed by the cloud, etc., which was really about how do you manage your infrastructure? Do you want to reboot your system yourself, or do you want to pay someone at Amazon to go reboot your system when you need to do that at the simplest level? And of course, they've built up from there. They do have a few more features in Amazon than just a reboot, right? So these two things have come together. And so from an infrastructure perspective, the question is still unanswered. My personal belief is that we're going to see a hybrid infrastructure for the foreseeable future. There are lots of reasons why it is better to be running in Amazon, and there are equally good reasons why you want to be running on-premise also. If you installed SAP 5 years ago, you went through an ERP transformation 10 years ago, you did it on-premise, it's running in your organization, believe me, you're going to be running on-premise for many, many years to come on that system. So it's going to be a hybrid world, and that's where the infrastructure challenges come in. And an example of that, I'll give another portfolio company of mine called Nexla, which helps you connect data sources between organizations. Of course, it could be inside an organization, but the more interesting challenge comes when you're within organizations. Now, you've got an organization that's hybrid. Perhaps it's running partially on Google and partially on-premise. And oh, guess what? Now you want to interface with another organization which is running on Amazon, or maybe they're all on-premise. And you want to do, of course, AI, because that's what's going to make all of these capabilities that Mark described possible. Well, how are you going to manage the data for this? Very hard. What Nexla does is intercompany data management. It's available as software as a service, on-premise, or in the cloud. They are processing, for example, Instacart. You place an order on Instacart, they have to interface with many different organizations to make it happen. That runs on Nexla today. 1 billion records a day being processed through it in a way that was inconceivable prior to AI and cloud existing.
Those are great examples, Thank you, Ashmeet. So, wanted to go back, maybe back to a little bit on your investment thesis, and then I do want to make sure the audience has time for a couple of questions. So, Mark, you talk about the Zetta generation, and your entire investment thesis is around the data strategy, right? So, can you provide a perspective on this? I think you alluded to it with your example of the inside sales, where everybody's contributing, right? But how fundamental is that as a tenet in terms of your investment strategy, in making sure there's a core value prop around data? Is that where what we should be thinking about?
Yeah, well, it's about intelligence and about the idea of things, putting a learning loop in place. People called it data network effects, but now it's the data and algorithms combined that really make that learning loop, or we call it the virtuous loop. And in terms of inside sales is just one example of a company that's implemented a virtuous loop to be able to take all that data, algorithms, clean the data coming out of the algorithms, have the data go back around, change evolve the algorithms. So you see this loop of data and algorithms constantly feeding on each other to make the system smarter. Everything we're investing in is including that. And frankly, I believe that everything that large corporations implement as new applications should be doing that, even the ones they build on top of their own systems of record. So effectively, we've moved to a system now that has that virtuous loop, and then you start to think about new ways of what is an AI-first application, whether that's a third-party application or whether that's a homegrown application. And so we looked at sort of 5 tenets of things to do. Now that we've moved from software basically being assembled, not built, but now the data side is being built. So the first thing is people talk about minimal viable products. We think that really what you should be thinking about now that you've moved from software to models is minimal algorithmic performance. So defining, we call it the map. So define the map of what's in your new model so you can get minimum performance to make it useful, and then see how you can improve it. Race to get a critical mass of usable data with that. Go around your organization, use products like Ashmeet talked about to be able to basically crowdsource data, in fact, across your entire organization to use. Choose the right entry point where the data network effects are going to be best, where you're going to see the most improvement, because that's going to endear your users to want to move around, to work with models. Figure out where your return is going to flatten out, so then you can move on to, just as in products, when you move to the next product feature, move on to the use of the next model.
Right.
And then maintaining your data rights leadership amongst your organization or to the third parties that you negotiate with. Because as we talked about, data rights now are where you differentiate in terms of your company. To talk about also, to add on to what Ashmeet was saying in terms of the infrastructure, I think what's really interesting today are two parts. The infrastructure is already changing. We're already moving to assembly and APIs. But two parts that have already moved. One part is the implementation now, as we talked about, of essentially model management collaboration systems that are sort of the analogy to what software collaboration was in an organization 25 years ago. And that's going to be very fast moving. There's going to be a lot of vendors in that. I think what people want to look towards are things like how easy can they work with systems to reproduce their models, to trace their models, to have transparency in their models. I think that's what's going to get the users in your organization excited to be moving into this new paradigm where they can actually trace it and see the risks that they may be creating for others in the organization. And the other, I would say, is that people have already invested in large systems like CRM and ERP, et cetera. They are no longer the engagement system that touches the user. So now they've become sort of like the data. They're in the vault, right? The question is, what do you put on top of that for people to use
Like Passage
constantly?
AI is an example that you put on.
Exactly.
Sure.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mark. That was very, I think, a comprehensive view of the data virtuous cycle. So, Ashmeet, the complementary side of that, would love to get your perspective. Again, I think a lot of us in the room are from the infrastructure side here, right? I love how you use the analogy of, is your data center a pet or is it cattle? Can you kind of comment on that perspective and, what should we be? I don't even know that. How about answering that?
Yeah, so I think the ideal scenario from an infrastructure manager's perspective is it should be cattle. In other words, you don't care if a particular server dies, a particular server lives. It shouldn't need special care or feeding. You really should be able to treat it as one of many interchangeable parts that you don't care much about. I hope I'm not offending the vegetarians in the room over here. But that's really the way, and Google pioneered this approach in terms of how they built their first data centers. And I think that is eventually where infrastructure will go. But from an investment perspective, that's not enough. At Engineering Capital, I always look for a technical insight. In other words, some creative new way of solving a problem that has not been done before. And I define it as follows. If you tell a good engineer what you're doing, they wouldn't know how you're doing it. That's a technical insight. You've got something novel, something new over there. And if you have that, there's no limit to human creativity. We're always coming up with new ideas, new ways of doing things. And that's really the heart of sort of my companies. They have a new way of doing something, solving a problem, which of course we then turn around and apply to enterprise IT and see what problems can we advance in the state of the art over there.
Which feeds the infrastructure, and serves the
Sure, because that
infrastructure
happens to be a very active area of investment and also my personal passion. So, it's kind of a match made in heaven for me to just go focus on that. So.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we just have a couple minutes. So if there are any questions, we might be able to take one or two from the audience. Tim.
With all the different solutions, we talk about the idea of confusion. What are the actual adoption rates of companies? I mean, you mentioned different sectors, first kind of high, but across the broader enterprise, what are kind of the adoption rates of these technologies?
I think the question is, what are the adoption rates of these technologies across enterprises? Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah.
So I'm seeing vastly different adoption rates based on the organization's agility and willingness to consume new technologies. So for example, in the banking sector, I'll take names over here. I don't know how broadly this is going to get broadcast. But if you look at Capital One, they are essentially running in the cloud, right? They've adopted them very early. They use machine learning very aggressively or AI very aggressively in terms of how they think and work on that. On the other hand, if you look at Bank of America, they are completely not in the cloud, yet they use AI very aggressively. And to do that, they've had to build the entire stack in-house. So they've got a very large center of competence, which is basically replicating external infrastructure. These are business decisions that they made. And so they're able to consume these technologies quickly, but in a very different way with a very different approach. So those are two examples of sort of companies in the speed and the way in which they've accepted sort of the new world.
I think in the way of companies, I think two things we're seeing very fast adoption. One of them is in companies that are trying to take all their different data sets and figure out ways to bring them together, whether that's internally or whether that's through applications that do that, because they're now realizing how much more value they get by that. And I think that's happening very quickly. And I think the other is the notion of moving to model management. Some sort of system is also moving very quickly and sort of broadly. The applications themselves, I think, are all moving at a slower pace, and they're going through a lot of proof of concepts for people to see what makes the most sense for them.
Makes a lot of sense.
Here's another test you can use internally in terms of, Mark talks about model management. The question I like to ask people is, how often do you have to update your model? In other words, retrain for it to be effective for the business problem that you're trying to solve over there. I actually did a poll with the three companies, Twitter, Facebook, and Google. Recently, I hosted dinner with a bunch of leaders from them. And here's the answer. It's shocking. Most organizations in a business level would probably retrain perhaps once a quarter, maybe once a month if it's interesting. Twitter, once a day. Facebook, once an hour.
Right.
Google, once a second.
Right.
That's when they retrain their most important model.
Models.
So in the case of Twitter, it's the follow engine. In the case of Facebook, it's the newsfeed placement. That's the question I really ask them, which is, for the single most important, most valuable thing you have in your enterprise, how often do you retrain your model? Once a second at Google. That's where we're headed. So that's how you have to think about it.
Consumer world will lead to the enterprise world, and we're going to go exactly that
We're
way.
going to go there because it's transformational when you can do that.
That's fascinating. So thank you for that. One more question? Otherwise, I think.
Deriving actionable insights from analytics is, I get that. What role does stewardship and governance in the data itself play into that, and how important is it in your mind? And how do you approach it?
We're investing in that area. I think that's going to be really important. Europe went to this concept more about the idea of just forcing people to opt in. In the United States, we haven't done that. So it's important for us to do best use in order to make a system that's not GDPR work. Who in your organization has access to what kind of data? What kind of governance do you have over what kind of data? What applications can use what kind of data? That's going to be what we're going to need to implement. And so I think you're going to see that as a next wave of things that companies will implement for governance here in the United States.
I think getting it right is make or break. No organization is going to survive without getting it right longer term. We are already seeing proof of that from the breaches, from Facebook, from the political feedback, etc., on all of these things. And it can be solved with regulation and governance, which is obviously the traditional approach. But what I'm always most excited about is it can also be solved with technology.
Right.
Do we have time? Can I give 1 second of a
Please,
description?
bless, yeah.
So I have a portfolio company, Baffle, which has invented a new way of letting you process SQL without decrypting the data. So if you have an organization, you can run your database. Let's say you use MySQL or Oracle or any traditional relational database. It has always been the case that the DBA had access to the data. If you run Baffle, you can run your database without the DBA having access to the data. It is only the application, the end user, who gets to see the data. That's a technical approach to solving the kinds of problems that are raised when we store all of this data and information over here.
Well, thank you, Ashmeet and Mark. With that, I think our time's up. Thanks very much.
Thank you.